Hi, I'm John Sicotte, executive editor of the Brewer Magazine. Welcome to another edition of the Brewer Magazine podcast, and we are sponsored by Keg Logistics. So you can find out more details there by going to keglogistics.com/Brewer Mag. And of course, you can like and subscribe to make sure that you're keeping up with what's going on in the podcast, both on YouTube and on Spotify. We appreciate those likes and subscriptions. It always helps out. Well, of course, you can find us every single day at brewermag.com, as we're always giving you business resources that way as well. All right, this was really cool. I love when I get input of people that want to talk about something on the podcast. Sometimes I feel like I'm out there fishing quite a bit, and so it's really great when someone fishes for me, wants to talk about something. And this is what we're getting into. For many people outside of the craft beer world, or even just on the edges of it, talking about consumers, craft beer usually means just one thing: IPA. And for a while, that really wasn't a problem, as the IPA really fueled what was happening in modern craft beer. It helped drive the innovations, and it really brought in a lot of new drinkers through the doors of breweries all over the nation. But you know what? That perception, it might be costing the industry a little bit more than it's actually giving. And this is what kind of got brought up. If the average drinker just assumes that all craft beer is the aggressively bitter and hazy sweet beers, are we really alienating a potential new audience? So I had the opportunity to talk to Brian Graham, the founder of 4 Day Ray Brewing in Indianapolis, and Tyler Montgomery from the Brewer Magazine, our publisher, who also owns a Better Brewing in Winchester, Kentucky, sat in and we tried to talk this through as bluntly as we could. Has craft beer IPA'd itself into irrelevance? So we kind of discussed some of this, and we want your opinions on this. Let me know what you think. You can always find me at john@thebrewermagazine.com. We're going to talk about this one style of beer and how craft beer can try to open up the gates a little bit more in this Brewer Magazine podcast. This Brewer Mag podcast is sponsored by Keg Logistics. Now's the perfect time to review your keg management strategy. Whether you're seeking a truly flexible keg rental program or intrigued by the seamless distribution freedom of paper fill, Keg Logistics is ready to craft a personalized solution for you, ensuring you receive the kegs you need precisely when you need them. For details, visit keglogistics.com/brewermag. Keg Logistics, modern solutions for keg efficiency. And we welcome in Brian Graham of 4 Day Ray, along with our publisher, Brewer Magazine, and the owner of a Better Brewing company in Winchester, Kentucky, Tyler Montgomery. Guys, thanks for joining us here on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian, you're the one that kind of kickstarted this thing with an email. And one of the things that you mentioned in that is that the IPA has kind of worked its way into irrelevance. Can you expand on the idea of what IPA means to the non-craft drinker, and if that's all they think about? I think that's been a hard part of this, and like a part of the conversation you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're all in business to make money, obviously, and as craft beer has gotten popular and exploded and everywhere, brewers are making things that sell, right? And I mean, there's no denying that IPA dominates the sales numbers. And so, you fast forward from when everybody was just like, oh my gosh, I can't get enough of craft beer, to now, and we're in more of a mature market, and everything that has been able to be called an IPA, or some things have been invented to be able to market things as IPAs. I think what's happened is that you get people who look at craft beer, and in their mind, craft beer equals IPA. And if you don't like IPAs, then, it's tough. So, that's an interesting place to be in this market when we're seeing, things be flat or, in some cases downturns. And so, I think, I think the BA did, there's some survey data out there where, they actually did a survey, and, people said, well, I don't like craft beer. And basically what they're saying was, I don't like IPAs. And so there's just this association with the two, that they're one and the same thing, which is unfortunate because there's every other beer style out there for people to experience, and a lot of things that are on trend with how people are consuming alcohol today. And, you have the lower ABV stuff, in that category. So, it's interesting where we find ourselves, and I think that there's an opportunity for sort of a renaissance, if you will, of craft beer, and just trying to figure out how to communicate that to the folks that are thinking, well, craft beer is just all IPAs.
Yeah, Tyler, do you agree that IPA dominance sometimes actually might be a liability for craft beer as an entire category?
I think at this point we've reached this level of IPA with craft beer where it's more of a crutch than it is anything else. I mean, every craft brewery across the United States creates an IPA. I do think the IPA is what generated so much hype around craft beer. And I think it's, I know IPA isn't traditionally an American established creation, but it's kind of like, it's kind of become American at this point. We do IPAs in a way that isn't really utilized around the world, or not even created as well around the world as it is in North America. But over the last 15 years, it's really become a crutch. It kind of started with the hazy, and then everybody plays around. Now you've got the IPL. You've got, we messed around with, what was that trend back 2019 where everybody was making
Brute.
the really clear, the Brute IPA.
Yeah, Brute IPA, yeah.
So it's like everything we can do, to your point, Brian, to just keep with some style of an IPA. Whereas, people think craft beer, they think IPA, but I don't think that's necessarily on the customer. Like, to your point, it's really on us to change that narrative. But the major distributors of craft beer anymore, all you find anymore is, mixed 12 packs of different hazy IPAs,
Right.
And it's walking through a Total Wine or, a local liquor store, unless you're looking at local stuff, it's just uninspiring. The national distributorships are totally focusing on hazy IPA 12 packs and this haze and that haze. And it gets to a point where it's kind of like listening to, one genre of music and being like, I don't like these bands because they only play this one genre of music. It doesn't differentiate itself well enough. And we're not doing a very good job as a whole creating this type of hype. We went down the lager movement starting around 2019 to 2020. Of course, COVID kind of hurt that a little bit, but moving out of 2020, pushing the lager movement, we had too many that went the American light lager as opposed to, and challenging macro beer as opposed to making really, really good crafted lagers. So, in Kentucky now, all we see is, Brewery A light lager or Brewery B light beer. And it goes against the whole idea of making really good, well-crafted lagers. And so it's challenging more of the macro style. It doesn't really help us in the direction of moving away from the IPA as a major craft marketer.
Yep. The hardest part with that, of course, is IPA sells. So
True.
How do you function with that? Like, where do you go if IPA is such a dominant seller for every brewery, and in theory you should be opened to make money? Are you helping or hurting your cause by having an IPA be the dominant characteristic of what craft beer is?
So for us, we've never, been that brewery where you walk in and 20 or half of our taps are IPAs. We've never done that. And we have a hazy and we have a West Coast style IPA, and and I think that when people come in, we have a wide variety of things. Like, we have three different Belgian beers on right now. We're about to put on a brown ale. We got a sour. We've got some fruited stuff. Like, but if you can't find something, you're probably just too picky, and we don't know, right? So, that's the way we've always operated. And I think that, with the IPA thing, it's interesting because they're expensive to make, right? So if you're in business to make money, you're getting a lower margin on that beer. And if that's your number one seller, like, you could be making more money if you sold other selections, other styles. And which is also interesting because for the proprietors, if their patrons can drink more beer, they make more money, we make more money, and it's cheaper to produce the beer as well. So there's like a win-win-win for everybody there if IPA is not the number one selling beer. And in a time when we're all trying to figure out like how to make more money, like that's really, I think, like a very powerful, conversation on how do we market and get people interested in these other styles. And, it's just interesting to me. I think back in like the early 90s when I first discovered craft beer, like most of it was imported stuff. And, you went around and you tried every style that you could possibly try, right? Because there wasn't a lot of access to things. And so, you had British and Belgian and, you're trying German stuff. And, it was this awesome, like, potpourri of different styles of beer. But, now you can't hardly find those that are fresh, to drink any of that stuff. And, you don't have a lot of people necessarily making a lot of those styles, in marketing, right? So that's kind of, what I've been thinking about. And just, it's just interesting, that we've got, like, this style that, really doesn't make much money unless you're selling it across the bar, right, as a pint. But if you're distributing it, I mean, your margin on that is definitely lower than anything else that you could be, putting out there.
Sure.
Brian, what's your thoughts on, do you think it's so much on the craft brewery itself, or do you think it's really changing the narrative through sales and marketing, working with distributorships? Because, I mean, if you're doing self-distribution, you're trying to change the narrative in-house with your other clients and working through bars and other, package stores and things like that. How do you get them to bite on something that's, say, not the traditional craft direction like an IPA or now a hazy
right.
IPA? If you're going to put out something, one of our flagships is a red ale. What are your thoughts on how do you push that narrative and work with your distributorships to make that narrative change?
Yeah, obviously they're going to be on board with what sells, right? So, and they want to make money too. I think it's a partnership in that sense. I think it's kind of like the Sam Cooke, kind of scenario. It's like hand-to-hand combat. Like you got to go out and you got to get people to taste the stuff. And, like the number one seller for us is a Blood Orange Blonde. And what we have found is we are not competing for the craft beer, like, that piece of the pie, because that beer actually appeals to people outside the craft beer market, right? Mm-hmm. So it has more of a reach, and it is appealing to people who are macro drinkers who are curious about craft, and they say, oh, wow, I had no idea. I don't like hops. I don't like anything that's bitter. This is refreshing. It's 4.2% alcohol. This is a great boat beer. I can drink it whenever. And our distributor has just, basically taken that all the way, to the bank, which is great. But I think it's going to be a renaissance is basically what it is. And I think it has to start with the brewers. And, people always ask me, like, what's your favorite beer? Like, what do you drink? And we make an ordinary bitter here. It's called Air-Aid. And, I mean, it's great. You can drink it with food. You can drink it by itself. It's just a good beer-flavored beer, right? And I always joke around with people about that, but it's true. And, I think that we just, it's just going to have to be kind of this, I don't know, it's just going to be a renaissance. And I think, more people have to look at it and be like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think we can capture more of the market and not really have to distract ourselves with, brewing the next seltzer or whatever. We don't have the capacity to do that. And you can still make beer a relevant beverage in today's market.
I happen to think, to your point, it wasn't the seltzer game that really deterred people from craft beer. It was all the hype around the IPA and just staying inside that hype. And to be quite honest, when we go and we do cover interviews or cover shoots for Brewer, what we run into a lot, I mean, that's where we're really seeing all of these mixed 12 packs of different haze. And it's the same beer used maybe with different hops or different additives. And I mean, I get it. You're making, one batch and splitting it 4 ways. And that kind of makes the expensive IPA a little bit more attainable, I guess, or however you'd want to think about it.
Sure.
I mean, it cuts your price down a little bit if you can split it 4 ways. But to me, it feels just uninspiring where, when we first launched Brewer in 2012, craft beer was one of the most inspiring sectors of industry. It was, it's not curing cancer, it's not making electric automobiles or anything like that, but it's such a unique space. And it was doing things with a beverage that the vast majority of America is drinking, Bud Light and Coors Light and things along those lines. And it really was just inspiring a generation of drinkers to consume something that was different. And the IPA was kind of the start of that. But seeing, that movement, how do you think we get back to making this industry inspiring again?
I think a lot of times it's just back to basics, right? Like, what is beer? And our tagline is brewed for community, right? So beer brings people together. And I think that, like, when you make it more sessionable, when people are sitting around and they're having a beer and they're just, talking for hours, they don't want to get hammered, right? And so, again, you look at the ABV of an IPA, man, you're probably like on the south end of maybe 6.8, on the north end of like 8.2, 8.5. If you're drinking a double IPA, it could be more than that, and that's not sustainable. That's not sessionable, and that's not what people want. So, I think it's it's just I know it sounds simple, and I don't think there's any like silver bullet to it, but I think brewers need to start having these conversations with their taproom staff. That kind of thing where they're just, you have to really educate your staff, and then it has to start with the brewers. And I like IPAs. I'm not saying that they're bad, but that's not the first thing I go to when I, drink something here at the brewery. And it's not my favorite beer. So I think that's just a conversation that we're going to have to start, and we're just going to have to, it's, like I said, it's a renaissance, and it takes a while, right? And I think we all just need to have one voice about it, and I think it could really change the trajectory of where beer is right now.
Oddly, it is my favorite category of beer. I've moved away from it over the years, and I've come back full circle with it. I love our West Coast. I drink it a lot. Our number one sellers, though, a Pilsner and a Mexican Cerveza. They sell great in-house. We've canned the Pilsner. It's sold horribly in market. We've sent it out. It usually sells horribly at the on-premise places anyways. The Mexican Cerveza actually sells pretty decently in market, but it doesn't sell necessarily very well on-premise, which is kind of sad. It really just, it does well if somebody drinks it, but why pay $6.50 for a Mexican Cerveza that's 4.2 and you could get something else? We operate, we're the only brewery in our town, and while that's lucky, we're in a Coors Light town. So that's why the Pilsner and the Cerveza always kick off in here. People love all the rest of the beers too, but those two light beers, we're a community center. So everybody comes and they sit down, and like to your point, they want to stay and have more than 2 or 3 beers, over the course of an evening. So they focus on those lighter beers. Nobody's jumping really heavily on our 10% Imperial. It kind of is what it is.
Well, do you think the problem has become a little something generational, though? I mean, we have raised a generation now of craft beer drinkers who think craft beer is IPA and IPA is craft beer. How do we get away from that? If, like you said, I mean, we don't want to eliminate the IPA, but just let people know there's more out there. I mean, where is it? Marketing? Is it education? Are they a combination of both? This Brewer Mag podcast is sponsored by Keg Logistics. Now's the perfect time to review your keg management strategy. Whether you're seeking a truly flexible keg rental program or intrigued by the seamless distribution freedom of paper fill, Keg Logistics is ready to craft a personalized solution for you, ensuring you receive the kegs you need precisely when you need them. For details, visit keglogistics.com/brewermag. Keg Logistics, modern solutions for keg efficiency.
Yeah, I think it's got to be definitely both. I mean, you both have probably been, especially you, Tyler, when you go to a beer festival, right? And you have everybody sampling, and the person walks up and they're like, "I don't like anything dark. I don't like anything hoppy," and that you're like, like, okay, well, I have this one beer for you, right? But when you
water in the background,
right? Yeah, I could help you. But when people walk up and you're like, "Well, I don't like IPA," it's like, oh, well, that's not a problem because I have every other thing here in my booth, and I have an IPA, but there's these other selections. What would you like? And that's a extended conversation while you're sitting there with a line of like 20 people, waiting to sample the beer. But like that's where that starts, right? And you're like, hey, look, try this Schwarz beer. I know that it's like black and it looks like a stout, but it's going to be really refreshing. It's a lager, and it's got flavor, but it's low alcohol and it's not bitter. Or try this Vienna lager. It's malty. There's it's not bitter, and it's going to have a dry finish to it. And you're going to just open people up to let them know there's so much more out there. And I think obviously festivals are really good for that. And then the taproom staff. I mean, they need to be educated in that regard. And I think it's just going to take a lot of drum beating and just education, and us again as brewers, having a voice about it and helping people understand that you can have a healthy lifestyle and still drink, craft beer, and those two can go together. And there's plenty of styles out there that afford you, that lifestyle that you're looking for, and you can still drink craft beer, and you don't have to, necessarily choose something else, or you can choose craft beer.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the best marketing gimmick ever designed in beer was Mick Ultra being an athletic beer. It's just,
right.
It's like, okay, so you want to go rollerblading. What are you going to do afterwards? You're drinking Mick Ultra.
For rollerblading. Man, I haven't taken that one up yet, but it sounds like I need to try it out.
No, not at our ages. You'll just end up hurt.
Well, and speaking to the generational aspect, not just even the consumers, but as a brewing industry, you have people that have maybe got into brewing when it was IPA is king over this last 15 years. How do you speak to the actual ownerships of breweries that they're out there that that are very much IPA focused? Is that something that you think they should be expanding their portfolio? Are they a niche that it's okay with what they're doing? I mean, what are your thoughts on that aspect too? Because there are those kind of breweries that just push IPA, and maybe that is part of that distortion and the homogenization of what IPA to craft beer is.
Yeah, obviously at the end of the day, right, you're going to produce what people are buying. And, you take somebody like Revolution or, anybody like that, I mean, they're not going to just change their business model. That's not what I'm suggesting. I would say that it's going to be, a taproom experience where it kind of starts, and, it would be, you have to know your consumer, right? And you're going to sell what they are buying. But I think there's a way to incorporate this other aspect of craft beer. And, somebody who is solely focused on IPAs, they can help their margin out, by just adopting some other things. And, not just a session IPA or anything like that. It's just like really, something that's, different, and be able to do that. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have a really good answer for it. I just know that, there's something to be done. And, this conversation here is a great start to kind of get the ball rolling on it.
How much do you think, the industry has become so segmented with, you have your large major national craft brewers, and then of course now we've seen this influx of smaller craft breweries popping up in smaller communities throughout the United States. How much do you think this narration change is on them versus it being on the national distributors, because the national craft brewer is going to force chase the dollars, and they're the one that's kind of in the market space pushing this narrative. But it's going to be easier probably to get this narrative changed on the smaller scale levels of your 1,000 to 5,000, maybe even inside 10,000 barrels a year type brewery.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And when someone's going out to their local brewery, I think it's a grassroots thing, right? It's word of mouth. It's the, hey, my server gave me this awesome beer. I hadn't even heard of it. I'm going to throw Saison in there because no one drinks them, but I do. So
every brewer drinks them. We make them for us.
I know, it's great, but because they go so well with food, I don't think people really understand that. But that's another side conversation for another time. But I think getting people excited about and a sample. It's like, hey, it's free, or being proactive with sampling. I got an idea from the Craft Brewers Conference where someone orders the first round of beer, and then the server, they just proactively bring a sample of something else and said, hey, you ordered that, you might like this. And doing simple things like that where, the guest didn't even order that sample, but we're bringing something out that might be adjacent or similar to something that they ordered. You kind of start the conversation that way, but I definitely think it's going to be the hyper-local guys who, if you want to sell more beer and you need to attract the IPA drinkers' friends, how do you do that? And so when you're there and, if you've got alternative beverages that you're offering along with the beer, so you got the IPA person and, whatever, and then you got some people drinking seltzers or whatever, focus on the people that are drinking the seltzers and be like, hey, I know it doesn't seem, do you like IPAs? Nah, I really don't like IPAs. Cool.
Yeah.
Here are a couple samples, that we could let you know. We got a whole other list of styles that you could try that, might be appealing to you.
I think one thing that we do really well in terms of front house staff is our bartenders do a lot of that. You order a pint of something, we'll let you try it out. Or you're a regular, you come in, you order your normal beer that you typically get, we're going to let you sample the new thing that's on.
Yep.
And just kind of creating that, I usually play trivia on Thursdays with a handful of people, and there's a couple of girls on our team. One day I'm drinking half and half of our summer ale with one of our hazy IPAs. It just cut it really nice and gave us still some different fruity flavors with it. They tried it. Now they all drink the hazy IPA, which they were all adamant that they don't like IPAs. And it's fine. But now they're back and forth between the summer ale and this hazy IPA. So, it does, I don't know. I think getting people opened up to just understanding what flavor profiles, because even the craft consumer or the person that is trying to become a craft consumer may see IPA and be like, I don't like IPAs. It's like somebody saying, when they were 10, they didn't like Brussels sprouts. And then they have, Brussels sprouts cooked with bacon and it's,
right.
glazed of it at like 25 or 30. And they're like, wait a second, maybe I do like Brussels sprouts. Like you didn't like IPAs when you were 15 and stealing it from your dad's cabinet. But, it's, you need, your taste buds are going to change. You got to open yourself up. So it's changing also the consumer awareness of what these beers actually taste like.
Well, and really, you kind of touched on this a little bit, and I had this question pre-written, so we can kind of delve more into it. But if we are going to look at remarketing craft beer as a whole and not just IPA is king, as we've all kind of said, where's that conversation begin? And we've kind of talked about it. It does begin, I think, locally. But if someone's watching this podcast right now and they agree with you, where do you think the conversation should go? Do you think it should go to your local guild, to the BA? Are you encouraging others to go to the media and being like, hey, we have a new beer release and it's not an IPA. I want to be able to talk about this. I want to give this more type of thing. Maybe even finding influencers in your area and telling them, hey, get in their ear. Like, we want to talk about beer more than just the IPA that we have out.
Right.
Do you see that kind of being the stepping stone from, let's say, what we're talking about here?
yeah, I think, guilds need to have the conversation. The BA certainly, can have a narrative. I think Bart touched on it briefly in his address. So, I think everybody getting together, like, breweries do collabs. And it's like, hey, it's not an IPA. Whoa, well, that's a big deal, right? And I think, that kind of thing is press worthy right now because, you're making a big deal about something that's not an IPA. And or maybe not a pastry stout. And, sorry, that's a whole other topic again for another podcast. I just, it's like, I just want beer. I just want beer flavored beer. But yeah, so having a collab and like you said, reaching out to these people and helping people understand exactly what we're talking about here. This can fit in with a healthy lifestyle. It doesn't have to be this way. And, we see what the consumer is looking for, and we're reacting in that way, and not just trying to make the things that everybody else are making. They're making, that's outside of craft beer. So yeah, I think that's exactly where the conversation needs to happen, and trying to get some press around that.
Here's a final thought, and it's kind of a heavy one that we can kind of finish up with, because why finish light on this topic? If we're brewing what sells, is it a good business decision, or is it evolving what craft's identity is?
I would say just it's pivoting what the identity is, right? Because the more occasions that you can be involved in, the more beer you're going to sell, right? So if your occasion right now is, I have an occasion for IPA, I mean, that's one occasion, right? And so I think that it makes the beer dinner more relevant and the culinary aspect of things, because let's be honest. I mean, the last time I tried to pair an IPA with a dessert, I mean, it didn't really go over very well, right? So I think there's a lot of things that are being missed that could be folded into this conversation. And I think it's just a simple pivot, and the information is already there, right? The identity is already there, but we just need to take the focus off of the IPA and shine the light on the broader category, so that people can be like, oh, right, like that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, that would be, it's just a pivot.
Tyler, how do you balance artistic intent with commercial reality?
God, that's a tough question. Good question, though. I think as business owners, we always have to think about what is actually going to make us money to keep moving the needle and keep the lights on. As brewers, I think we're creators and artists on top of also being business owners. And I think leaning on staff and having good people that'll kind of push that creative direction, and not just settle for what's going on just because it's making a paycheck or whatever. I think having those people inside your doors is really instrumental. But you've kind of got to do the things that, generate the revenue. I mean, I don't really think, creating light lagers is going to be the greatest thing in the world, but, Brian, to your point, they're cheap to make, and people are selling them left and right, trying to jump into, cut into these macro profits. And, it so much reminds me of the late 90s and early 2000s, and you saw the craft crash. It just people running into those elements. There's going to be the breweries that are always going to lean on IPAs, and because they're so profit driven. Smaller breweries have the ability to make those profit driven IPAs or profit driven beers, and then you're going to have open tanks, and you've got to use those open tanks to do some weird stuff from time to time and challenge the customer's palate. And then, Brian, to your point, you've got to educate your staff and really, kind of push it on people. For our anniversary beer this year, we made a triple, and it sits at about 9.6, which is kind of a heavy hitter, but it's not a heavy hitter IPA. It drinks like a 5% blonde. People get on it and they love it. It's a couple of nights wrong for a couple of people, but it
can happen.
They learn and they enjoy it, and It's not a quick mover in our tap room, but it moves and people enjoy it. It's a one-time creation, but using those moments for one-time creations. We're doing a couple for Oktoberfest this year. We're doing a Dunkel and then a Hefeweizen that we think is going to be really unique. Usually for Oktoberfest, it's the traditional pumpkin beer, and then we do a really good Martin. So we wanted something else this year because pumpkin beers are just becoming hell on earth, and it's no longer enjoyable for anyone, even the brewer, to create it. So we had to pivot off something else. And it's, like you said, it's a pivot. And educating them, we're going to educate them on, a new Dunkel, what a Hep looks like. We're going to do 2 towards the end of this quarter and another one going into the last quarter. So I think it's just showing these people what creativity really can be. And then they're like, okay, now I want to go back to this IPA. That's fine. But you just tried 3 different styles of beer in this flight, 4 different styles of beer in this flight. That's great. Now get your IPA if you want, or go back to your Pilsner if you want, whatever you want to do. But we see a lot of that. People get really, we try and stay at least a little experimental once or twice a year. And not experimental like, throwing, sausage links into a sour or something like that. We're not trying to do all the cereal beers and things like that either. I mean, we're trying to make beer flavored beer that we put some thought into and some work into thinking about how we want this to be perceived. And I think that goes a long way. And more people just need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I just want to say, for the people that are focused on IPA, like, it's not our number one seller. So I'm not saying that this conversation is easy. And I'm not saying that, everybody should just change their business model either. But I think that we owe it to ourselves as a community to be able to have a conversation that's broader than just like, what's the next IPA or bitter beer that I can invent so that I can sell it, right? And, that's what I'm saying. And in it, it's not going to be an easy task. And, there's a category of people that are out there that aren't drinking IPA, and it's probably a pretty large number of people. And I think that is a market, that could be captured. And, we can't, unless you focus on it, you aren't going to make a change in that area.
One of the things we did when we launched this new, when we upgraded to this 10-barrel system we're on now, which I know isn't anywhere near the size of what's behind you, Brian, but when we did this, we first got self-distribution rights in Kentucky. So we were like, we're going to target this. It's totally thrown our distribution system into the air, and nobody can get signed that's starting up new. And it's created this horrible situation, but created this beautiful situation where we can handle our own self-distribution and things like that. But what we did is, as a small brewery, as a nano brewery, we were just making whatever we wanted, being as creative as possible because we weren't distributing at all. Everything was consumed in-house, and it would be gone within a weekend, and it was fine. Moving into this, we have to think about the distribution areas and what's going to make an impact. We started looking at the list of all of our friends, what they're all distributing, what their big beers are, or not big beers, but their profitable beers are. And then we started segmenting the market. So that's why we went with the Irish Red. That's why we actually make a West Coast as opposed to a hazy that goes into the market, because there wasn't really a good West Coast in our market. So we plugged it with the red, and they really stick. Our number one package sold beer is an IPA, and I think it's going to be like that, but it's just not the number one sold beer by a long margin in our tap room. So I think we have taken this Coors Light town, and that was my goal launching this side brand from Brewer, was to generate something in this town and change the narrative. And being a Coors Light town, people that are used to drinking water, you can really spin that on them and just educate them on what it is. But it's having good bar staff, having good bar management that can work with your staff and make sure that they're educating your customer properly, and then just let them bleed out and carry the narrative with them.
Tyler, I think you kind of touched on it, and it's basically what Wee Willie Keeler, Hall of Fame baseball player, said: hit them where they ain't. And that seems to, I mean, we're talking about that in the overall thing, because it's,
Yep.
if IPA is the home run, the single down the right field line, is going to be just as impactful for you. So it hit me. By the way, I had to Google that. I thought it was Babe Ruth that said that. So there's your, in case you didn't know who said that.
Oh,
famous
fact
line.
checking. Nice.
Yeah,
Cool.
nice. It's about runs, Moneyball.
Yeah, Moneyball, little Moneyball. So, well, Brian
That's
and
right.
Tyler, I think it was it's a great conversation. I think that people should, if they're hearing this, take this, talk about it internally with their staff, internalize it, talk to other breweries in your area. I mean, we're all Midwest right here, basically Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, but this is a state or countrywide conversation. And Brian, I thank you so much for bringing this up and giving us an opportunity to kind of start the wheels going on this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for being interested in it. You never know unless you ask somebody about it, right? So.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's always nice to have readers and people we've worked with over the years reach out to us and be like, I have an idea. We want to do this. That's fun.
Cool. Nice.
Well, thanks, guys.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.
Great job. See y'all.
This Brewer Mag podcast is sponsored by Keg Logistics. Now's the perfect time to review your keg management strategy. Whether you're seeking a truly flexible keg rental program or intrigued by the seamless distribution freedom of paper fill, Keg Logistics is ready to craft a personalized solution for you, ensuring you receive the kegs you need precisely when you need them. For details, visit keglogistics.com/brewermag. Keg Logistics, modern solutions for keg efficiency.